Speaking of stories, we really need Matt Wentz to tell us a story of what's going on with this shirt, dude. What is the Hawaiian shirt you got rolling out there?
Oh, listen, Betsy, if it's above 75, I'm busting this thing out, all right?
Okay.
I think a lot of people are wearing their Hawaiian shirts right now. So I wonder where yours is and where Dave's is. I know you guys have it somewhere.
I'll put mine on when I get home. Inside the studio, I always go tie. Sorry.
Oh, that's smart. That's probably why you're still employed, Dave. That's great. So, fantastic.
No comment.
But guys, it's wonderful outside. Betsy, you and I were talking earlier today just about this change and how rapid it happened. Once we got the clouds out of here this morning and the fog, boom, that warmth hit. And boy, it has really snuck up on us. In fact, Hopkins, this last hour, went all the way up to 77 degrees. So we are certainly talking fall time warmth around here. So our last average 77-degree day or warmer in Cleveland is October 11th, so we are in bonus territory. Akron, Mansfield, you were above 77 today. Your average last 77-degree day is October 8th, so this is certainly getting into rare territory. It certainly happens this time of year, but just if you need another excuse to get outside this evening and enjoy it, that is certainly one. We do have a little bit of lake breeze today. Whenever you don't have much of a push to the atmosphere or much surface wind, you tend to get that cooling off the lake. So if you're within a couple miles of the lake, you're enjoying temps in the 60s. The rest of us, it's very summer-like. We're in the mid and upper 70s outside. But look at the difference. 80s south of that boundary we've been watching all week. 30s off towards the west. That boundary's heading our way as we get towards the weekend, but not tonight. A summer-like night, we'll have a decent breeze out of the south. A good windows open night. We should fall back only in the low 60s for an overnight low. You can see the clouds and the rain we had last night along that warm front lifting well to the north. We're well entrenched in the warm area of this storm system, but off towards the north, yeah, there's more snow for the upper Midwest. You can see that area of low pressure and the very, very sharp line between the warmth and the cool. One state in particular dealing with that right now is Iowa. It goes from 81 down in southeastern Iowa to 34 in the northwestern corner. It's about 250 miles, which would be comparable to Cleveland and Cincinnati being that 50-degree difference. National Design Mart hour-by-hour forecast. How long does this last? I think that's what we want to know. Again, mild tonight. Tomorrow, it's going to be a beautiful start to your day. We'll see sunshine, a nice south wind. We're well into the 70s once again, but by midday and early afternoon, you'll notice the clouds will start to thicken up. We'll bring some showers and thunderstorms in here just in time for that evening rush hour. And as those move through, our temperature will drop. And look at that. Saturday morning, we're in the 40s, and it's going to be a tough climb to get to 50 on Saturday. So like a sore thumb, you can see Friday sticking out, 77 p.m. storms. And then for the weekend, we are going to have some dry hours later Saturday. Most of Sunday looks dry, but we bring back rain chances and temperatures staying in the 50s. So guys, when you see a 77 kind of peeking out amongst the forecasts and looking over the next 7 days, you have to take advantage of it.
Definitely do. And Matt, you've got to check on Emmy. She totally upstaged you there at the top of your forecast because she was on a rocking horse. So we may want to check on her. I think she's right behind you. Shh, don't tell. All right, everybody.
She's digging in the dirt, I think.
We're going to check in with Matt coming up again in just a few minutes. Oh, my goodness. We'll get the story on that.